perhaps make a suggestion to that. I appreciate your concern and what goes into it, but there's some pretty good direction that we gave in the last presentation about what you expect to be in the Delta Science Plan as articulated in the Delta Plan. So what we've been doing, if this is really going to work, we have to make it work with many of these other programs. So if I could just perhaps go through a few of the slides so you know where we are and where our thinking is right now. And then absolutely, you need to see what it's looking like, and then does it fit your needs. So I'm going to skip over just a few of these, but as part of the conference too, we introduced some new technologies. We were experimenting that if this is going to be a community plan, the concept of having really big face-to-face meetings is not going to be very efficient, particularly when staff are so stretched. So some of the things we did was to experiment with technologies, and we were checking the responses we got from 3 or 4 different methods which we used at the conference. So this is actually an online voting tool. So when you give a presentation, if you've got a smartphone sitting in the audience, you can just poll. So this was just one of those examples. Do we need a shared vision on how we conduct science? So what we're looking at here is, as Chair Eisenberg said, we really want to understand how is the business of science conducted, what's working well, what isn't, and how might we be able to affect that. And so the response which we picked up in the meeting was that, one, it maxed out the capacity of the system, and it was 83% of the respondents said, absolutely, we need this shared vision.
Peter, so what were the numbers there before? 255,000, 494?
That means 1,000 scientists sitting in a room with cell phones will produce 500,000 comments.
Like American Idol, right? You just put it on automatic and keep voting for your pick?
So the way the system works is, it's actually a very cool technology, and it worked well, is that if you've got a cell phone, you text a message to the number that's in the top left-hand corner there, the 2233, okay. And then you put in the message line one of those 3 numbers. And it comes up instantaneously, if you've got a web connection, onto how people are voting and what people's opinions are. So that's how that works.
Okay, but is that a numerical count?
No, that was a code.
So 2555503. Oh, that's the code. You said upper right, so that's the code you put. Okay, all right, I got it. Nothing wrong with me. Just looking at the numbers.
Right. So where we are in the process is that we wanted to understand the current status. How is science actually done in the Delta? We wanted to do a synthesis of priority science issues because people have been looking at this for 10 years. So we wanted to know what's already been out there. We wanted to understand something about the technological innovations. If we're going to build a science community, what are other branches of science doing to facilitate and enable this type of open science? We've also completed an analysis of other science plans for similar large-scale programs, and Lindsay compiled, I think it was 14 or 15 similar science plans, and then we looked for ones where there may be some relevance of what we're doing, so we're not starting from scratch. We then, last week, had the town hall meeting where we had several objectives. One was just to publicize what we were doing. We wanted to get feedback. We wanted to know how to engage people in the process. And we also wanted to get some idea of what the barriers might be to completing this community science plan. And the next step is then to put out a straw skeleton of what the science plan might look like, which is, I think, what you were getting to, Chair Eisenberg. I'm going to skip over this because this is going to take too long. We've also looked at the adaptive management process where things break down. And one of the key areas that was highlighted by the National Research Council was this science policy disconnect. And so this shaped our thinking and how we put the town hall meeting together. And we really appreciate Mr. Fiorini helping us with the planning of that. I'll come back to that in a moment with the science plan. So what's actually been put out there as key issues related to science in the Delta? We've identified almost 500 separate issues which can be categorized under these 8 topics. We also analyzed that relative to the uncertainties which have been documented by the ERP process a few years ago. A few comments on what other science plans look like. These are the 5 plans which we thought have the most relevance to what we're doing here. And just to get a feel of what might be coming, here I just summarized the number of pages of those reports. So of course the content is important, but just to give you an idea of the scope and whether this is more of a high-level direction document or if it's getting into the weeds. So there you can see it varies. The Everglades is 150 pages with a lot of appendices down to something that's just 23 pages long. This is broken down. So in the left-hand column here, you can see the short version of what you required the science plan to do in the Delta plan. So this is pulling out all of the references in the Delta plan saying what we need to do. And then this is just a comparison of these topics and where they addressed in these plans which have the greatest relevance to what we're trying to achieve here. So you don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see some have overlaps, but not many of them cover all of the areas which we're tasked with looking at. So going back to that communication and the connection between the science and making that relevant to how decisions are made. And several things you drove this. The first thing that Eisenberg, when you took me around to meet with the various agencies when I first arrived, and we sat and we listened to what the main concerns were, we synthesized all of that information, and what came over very clearly is that we need a new way of conducting science in the Bay Delta. How do we do the synthesis activities required by NRC that go across programs, and how do we build this long-term system understanding? So in the town hall meeting, it was also driven by the State Water Resources Control Board, where several of the board members were frustrated during the hearing. And they just said, and I think Mr. Fiorini, you were there, it got to well into the PowerPoints. And one of the board members said, look, we specifically asked people to come with new ideas. We wanted to know what's new in the science that wasn't there in 2010, and we want innovative ideas for solutions. We don't want to just hear your particular agency or organization's perspective. And so the way we structured this was to invite a representative from the Stewardship Council, a representative from the state agencies, a representative from the federal agencies, to throw out what they perceived was a grand challenge. What's the biggest challenge that you have for the science community? Not that it can be resolved now, but over the next 10 to 20 years. And so the idea was then to open to the science community to say that what do we need? How do we need to change the way we do business in order to meet those grand challenges which were outlined? And so in the town hall meeting, we're very grateful to Director Cowan, Mr. Fiorini, and Ren Hoffner from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who came and laid out their perspectives. And do I have time just to mention very briefly what those grand challenges were, because they meet exactly what you're tasked with doing. And so here I'm paraphrasing in a very brief manner, but these 3 panelists, the science community, the response was just overwhelming. That they said this is the first time we've had a chance to meet face-to-face with leaders and engage in this very frank discussion. And so some of the grand challenges, I'm not going through in order, and as it was an open meeting, I won't attribute the remarks to any particular one of the panelists. But one of the issues was that there are 41 animals and 33 plants in the Delta that are either endangered or threatened. So how do you balance the conflicting needs between all of these various species? Particularly when one of those, or 2 of those species, like salmon and smelt, dominate the conversation. So how do you do the science? How do you balance these conflicting requirements. And one of the terms which I really liked was, whatever we do needs to be sustainable and attainable. So it's not just, we can't do everything for one particular species perhaps if it's not realistic. So the attainable really gets to the balance that you were talking about a moment ago. The second big issue was, how do we begin to develop a suite of tools or models where you can actually see the impact, whether it's restoration, whether it's water diversions, whether it's taking more water out? How can you follow that through the whole cascade of processes to really understand what the consequences are in a very clear and transparent method? The third issue which came out that got a lot of, well, all of these got a lot of traction with the science community. But we need to implement these projects. And the suggestion was, let's go out and do something bold and let's monitor that and let's understand everything from permitting, what the outcomes are. Let's develop measurable objectives and let's test the methodologies, particularly for adaptive management, before we move into full-scale production. And the comment that came out there is that adaptive management should enable, not be a barrier. Because many small projects, if we're too onerous on adaptive management, could preclude some actions happening. So this is, again, I think, is a call for your comprehensive adaptive management program that people can tap into. And then, of course, decision-making under uncertainty, which we heard, that was a pervasive theme. And it was interesting, there was two sides to that, is can we make decisions on what we know already because we know a lot? And then can we quantify that uncertainty so those people tasked with making the decisions can balance that uncertainty themselves? Because, as I think was mentioned by Mr. Knopp, it's not going to be the scientists making that decision. So if you're the Director of Water Resources, how do you weigh those decisions? As a response to that, Jim Klern, who had just returned from a series of hearings in Washington, D.C., that is actually looking at this issue. And basically his appeal was, we need to take a very fundamental look at how we link the policy, the decisions with the science. And so most of the discussion that came out of the town hall and the written responses and the web responses have been geared exactly towards that. So this is just a picture of the town hall meeting. The plenary session immediately before this ran late, so there was about 400 people showed up without lunch. They skipped lunch in order to participate, which I think is indicative of the interest in this science policy interface. You were talking about the participants. This is just a breakdown by percent of those people who attended. A few engineers there, and this is something we would obviously look at in the future. But overwhelmingly more than 50% scientists. Where did those people come from? No elected officials, but you can see there's a pretty good spread across the various agencies and other interests. And here we haven't analyzed all of the responses. Obviously there was a lot from last week. But just to take off a few of the comments. So the format was many people engaged with the panel members, but then we had a web interface and a questionnaire to glean additional information. And one of those was, what is your one idea that would really make a difference? And so first of all was a knowledge of a common understanding. What do we really understand that is beyond dispute right now? Another idea was this idea of high-level translators to go between the science community within the agencies and those tasked with policy. So those translators would operate in both directions. The idea of bold interactions now to test the hypotheses. So there's a lot of ideas out there, but let's do something big and bold and learn from that. The system-wide perspective, and then I'll skip over that. So that's where the science plan sits right now. I think we've generated a lot of information, and the next step is to move to this skeletal plan, as we've called it, which is the outline of what the plan will do and some placeholders and description of what each of the elements will function.